So where are we? We've looked at a number of things. We looked at the growth and development of international law. We've looked at what is a state and what is an organization and what are their roles in international law. And finally, we looked at the sources of international law. Where does international law come from? For this last topic, we're going to look at what's the future of international law. What do we see in the future? And we're going to take that from two different perspectives. And the first is international law is dying. We ask the question, is international law dying? Well, what do we have to support that notion? Well, we can certainly look at the state of the world. The current world order is in flux. The United States has been at war continuously since the beginning of the 21st century. There is little chance that that state of forever war will end anytime soon. So we will have to adjust to this notion that we are always at war. War is not something that happens between this year and that year and then ends, and then we have a period of peace, and then there's another war breaks out. Now we're in this state of constant war. And that casts doubt on international law because ultimately military considerations are always going to take precedence over diplomatic solutions. And in fact, in the last decade, we've seen a much greater reliance on military solutions as opposed to diplomatic solutions. The European powers, those powers that once were some of the strongest nations in the world, have now banded together as the European Union, largely to maintain some relevance on the world stage. You have countries like England and France, which are very small from a population perspective, small from a geographic perspective, and yet have always played this outsized role. Well, now the only way that those countries maintain relevance is by banding together in the European Union. We have limited ideas of what Russia wants or what Russia is going to become. We had, this long period of the Soviet Union in which there was this antagonistic relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers. The Soviet Union collapses. We have a roughly 10-year span in which the United States and Russia are allies again. And yet now for the last 5-10 years, we are seeing an increasingly antagonistic relationship between the two. What is Russia's future? Is it Russia-Europe, or is it a counterbalance to the United States plus Europe? China, economic superpower, unquestionably, but what is China? It's clearly from an economic capitalistic perspective, it's a juggernaut, but does China want to play a role on the world stage as a legal entity, as something along those lines? A country like India, our second most populous nation in the world after China, certainly on the rise. India has even managed to land a satellite on Mars. The Middle East is in a constant state of turmoil with little indication of that being resolved anytime soon. Independent sovereign states now govern most of the world territory. So what we've seen is that the world is in flux. The world that we attempted to put into place after World War II, which is a combination of American idealism along with European concepts of law and justice, well, that system is starting to fray around the edges. And in fact, one could say that international law is dying because the institutions that it's based on is dying. We start with this notion of Western legal traditions. I've kind of alluded to the fact that international law has been Western law, Western Europe and Anglo-American law. Sources of international law have invariably been Western in nature. Customary law, when we talk about customary law, we're talking about customs in the West, not what occurred in Africa or Asia, other parts of the world. So, and the same with general principles. When we're talking about general principles, we're really looking at what are the general principles in Western Europe and the United States and Canada, North America. So Western legal traditions are becoming increasingly irrelevant in a world with 192 countries. Another institution that's dying, or certainly not as important, is the state. Remember, the state used to be the main character in international law, the primacy of the state. But what we've seen is that the state has become increasingly less important. 9/11 in the United States was carried out by a non-state entity. I know at the time people kept trying to create some sort of Pearl Harbor analogy, but there was no analogy to be made because the entity that invaded the United States at 9/11 was not a state. And now, of course, non-state groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State have become the new norm. And in fact, we have numerous areas around the world in which the notion of the state is becoming increasingly irrelevant. Look at Syria. Syria is subject to control by dozens of factions, none of which fit the traditional definition of statehood, of a state. Throughout the Middle East especially, we've seen separation along ethnic lines and religious lines. Well, that's not what a state is supposed to be. That's not how a state works. In Kosovo, which I mentioned again, Kosovo based essentially on ethnic principles, ethnic guidelines, and if in fact every ethnicity gets to be a state, then what is the purpose of having states at all? So the state is certainly an institution that's dying. There are other issues at play. Certainly technology could lead to the downfall of international law. Clearly social media leads to the sort of snap political decision making that are designed to please local constituencies and not taking a long-term view. Democracy, certainly the Western notion of democracy, one might say that it's in danger too. The core belief of democracy is that people are peaceful and that they are self-interested. And the only problem occurs when the state gets in the way of that. Remove the state and people will choose their best path. Well, I think we've seen over the last few years that removal of the state does not increase peaceful activity. Instead, it is a detriment to peaceful